It is just after 4 in the morning on November 13th, 2022. In a quiet college town called Moscow, Idaho, a 3-story rental house sits on a small hill on King Road. Inside, 6 young people are asleep or just coming home from a normal Saturday night. Within a few minutes, 4 of them will be dead, and the town where no one had been murdered in 7 years will never feel safe again. Here is what makes this case so haunting. The man who did it was eventually caught. He confessed. He is in prison right now, and he will die there. And yet, after everything, after 2.5 years, a mountain of evidence, and a guilty plea, the families still do not know the one thing they need to know. Why? Why that house? Why those 4? Why any of it? The judge said it plainly. We now know who did this, but the world may never know why. Stay with me until the end, because this is not just the story of how 4 beautiful young people died. It's the story of how investigators built a case out of almost nothing. A knife sheath, a car, and a piece of DNA, and the question that even a confession couldn't answer. If cases like this are why you're here, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely helps. Let's get into it. First, let's talk about who they were, because they were not the 4 victims. They were 4 specific people with families who loved them, and they deserve to be remembered as more than the way they died. Kaylee Goncalves was 21. She had just finished her degree in general studies, early because she was driven like that. She had a job lined up in Texas and was days away from starting a whole new chapter of her life. She almost wasn't even at the house that weekend. She had already moved out and gone home. She came back for just a couple of days to show off a new car she had bought and to see her best friend one last time before everything changed. That best friend was Madison Mogen. Everyone called her Maddie. She was also 21. Kaylee and Maddie had been best friends since 6th grade, inseparable for years. There is a now famous photo of the 2 of them from that very last night, smiling, arms around each other. They died in the same room, in the same bed. In the end, they were together, the way they had been for most of their lives. Xana Kernodle was 20. She was known for her energy, her humor, the kind of person who lit up a room. She lived in the house too, and that weekend, her boyfriend was staying over. His name was Chapin. He was also 20, a triplet, one of 3 siblings who all attended the University of Idaho at the same time. Ethan didn't even live in that house. He was only there because he was staying the night with Xana. He was, by every account, a genuinely kind, easygoing young man. He was in the wrong place, on the wrong night, for reasons that had nothing to do with him. 4 young people. 2 more roommates lived in that house too, on the lower floors. They survived. Remember them, because they matter later. Now let's walk through that final night, because the timeline is a huge part of this story. The house on King Road was unusual. It was built into a hillside, 3 stories tall. From one side, it looked like a normal 2-story home. It had 2 separate entrances on different levels. Kaylee, Maddie, and Xana had bedrooms on the upper floors, and it was, by all accounts, a social house, a place where students came and went constantly. That detail matters because it means a lot of people had been through those doors. That Saturday night, the 4 split into 2 groups. Kaylee and Maddie went out to a bar in town. Around 1:30 in the morning, they were caught on camera at a local food truck, buying pasta, a small, ordinary, painfully human moment. They got a ride from a private driver and arrived home just before 2 in the morning. Xana and Ethan had been at a party at a fraternity on campus. They got back to the house at around 1:45 in the morning. By 2 in the morning, all 4 were home. The house went quiet, and somewhere out in the dark, a car was already circling. Investigators would later establish that a white sedan drove past the house that night. Not once, multiple times. It passed the area repeatedly in the hour before the killings, as if the driver were watching, waiting, working up to something. And then, at around 4 in the morning, that car stopped. What happened over the next 15 minutes, we know only in outline, because the one person who could describe it has chosen not to. But at the plea hearing, the prosecutor laid out what the evidence showed. The killer entered through a sliding door on the kitchen level. He went up to the top floor first, and there, he killed Kaylee and Maddie, the two best friends, together in the same room. Then, on his way back down, something happened that the prosecutor believes was not part of the plan. He encountered Xana Kernodle in a second-floor hallway. She was awake. Evidence suggested food had just been delivered to the house, so she was likely still up. The prosecutor's words were careful but chilling. The killer encountered her and ended up killing her. The implication was that she was not necessarily a target. She simply saw him. And because she saw him, her boyfriend Ethan, asleep in her room, was killed too. 2 of the 4 may have been targets. The other 2 may have died simply because they were there. That is a thought that is almost impossible to sit with. And then the killer left. He left behind almost nothing, except for one thing: a knife sheath. A tan, military-style sheath for a K-bar knife, the kind of blade sold in hardware stores, popular with hunters and collectors in that part of the country. It was found on the bed, next to Madison Mogen's body. The killer took the knife with him. It has never been found, but he left the sheath. And on the button snap of that sheath was a single, tiny trace of DNA. That mistake would end his freedom. Now, here's the part of the story that is the hardest to talk about, and I want to be very careful and very respectful here. 2 roommates were still alive in that house, on the lower floors, and one of them, identified in court only as DM, had an encounter that will stay with her for the rest of her life. According to court filings, sometime during those early morning hours, she opened her door after hearing sounds, and she saw a figure. A man, dressed in black, wearing a mask over the lower part of his face. He walked past her toward the sliding door and left. She described him as having bushy eyebrows. Then, in shock, she went back into her room. The phone records tell a heartbreaking story. The surviving roommates were active on their phones through the early morning, but they did not call for help right away. In fact, several hours passed before anyone called 911. The call finally came at 11:56 in the morning, roughly 8 hours after the attack. On that call, a voice can be heard saying that someone had seen a man in the house the night before. Now, I want to say something plainly, because the internet was cruel to these young women. It is easy, from the outside, to ask why they waited. But these were 2 young people who had just been through something unimaginable, in the dark, terrified, likely in shock, and probably not even understanding what had happened upstairs. They are victims too. They did nothing wrong. The only person responsible for those deaths is the man who walked in with a knife. Nobody else. When police finally entered that house late that morning, they found a nightmare. And the town of Moscow, Idaho, plunged into fear. Because for weeks, there was no suspect. And that is what turned this from a local tragedy into a national obsession. Think about it. 4 students stabbed to death in their beds, in a safe little college town. No weapon, no named suspect, no obvious motive, and a killer still out there, somewhere, walking free. Students fled campus. Parents drove through the night to bring their kids home. People bought locks, cameras, weapons. The community flooded the police tip line. Residents reported every strange sound, every locked door, every suspicious person. Someone even reported a man going around tearing down the police flyers that advertised the tip line. And into that vacuum of fear rushed the internet. Armchair detectives on social media and forums built theory after theory. They accused innocent people. They spun stories about stalkers, about drugs, about secret grudges. Almost none of it was true, and some of it did real harm to real people. This is the ugly side of a case with no answers. When officials stay silent, the public writes its own story, and that story is often wrong and cruel. But while the internet spun in circles, investigators were quietly, methodically closing in. And the way they did it is genuinely one of the most impressive pieces of detective work in a modern case. It started with that knife sheath. The single trace of DNA on the snap didn't match anyone in the FBI's criminal database. A dead end in the old days. But investigators used a technique called investigative genetic genealogy. They ran the unknown DNA through public ancestry websites, the same kind ordinary people use to find distant cousins, and slowly built a family tree, narrowing down to a single name. Then came the car. Surveillance footage from around the neighborhood had captured a white sedan near the house at the time of the murders. Investigators identified it as a white Hyundai Elantra. They started hunting for every one of those cars in the region. One of them was registered to a 28-year-old man named Brian Kohberger. And when they looked at Brian Kohberger, the pieces started falling into place in a way that was almost too fitting to believe. Kohberger was a PhD student. His field of study was criminology, the science of crime and the criminal mind. He was studying, at that very moment, how criminals think and how they get caught. He lived just across the state border in Pullman, Washington, only about 10 miles from the house on King Road. Investigators pulled his phone records, and they showed that his cell phone had traveled to the area of the house multiple times in the months before the murders, over a dozen times, mostly at night. On the night itself, the phone data showed his phone leaving Pullman and then going dark right around the time of the killings, as if it had been deliberately turned off, before coming back online and returning home. Then there was the Amazon history. Investigators found that Kohberger had purchased a K-bar knife, a sheath, and a sharpener online months before the murders. The same brand of sheath that was left on Madison Mogen's bed. And finally, the DNA. To confirm the genetic genealogy match, investigators needed his actual DNA. They found it in the trash, at his family home in Pennsylvania, where he had traveled for the holidays. They recovered discarded items, and the DNA was a match to the trace on the knife sheath, a near-certain identification. On December 30th, 2022, more than 6 weeks after the murders, police raided his parents' home in Pennsylvania and arrested Brian Kohberger. He was extradited back to Idaho to face 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. There was even a detail that felt almost too dark to be real. Hours after the murders, Kohberger took a selfie. He is smiling, giving a thumbs up to the camera. Investigators would later present that photo. A man who, according to the case against him, had just killed 4 people, posing for a cheerful picture the same morning. So the case went toward trial, and the evidence just kept mounting. The DNA on the sheath, the car on the cameras, the phone pinging near the house a dozen times, the Amazon purchase, the genetic genealogy. Piece by piece, it formed a wall that the defense could not get around. His lawyers fought hard. They tried to get the DNA evidence thrown out. They tried to challenge the phone data. They even pointed to that thumbs-up selfie, arguing it showed he didn't have the bushy eyebrows the surviving roommate had described. The judge allowed the key evidence in. The wall held. And then, in the summer of 2025, just weeks before the trial was supposed to begin, it ended in a way almost no one expected. On June 30th, 2025, Brian Kohberger accepted a plea deal. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he agreed to plead guilty to all 4 murders and to waive his right to ever appeal. On July 2nd, he stood in court, and in a series of flat, one-word answers, he admitted it. Yes, he killed them. Yes, he did it willfully, deliberately, with premeditation. For the families, this was a gut punch wrapped inside a resolution. On one hand, finally, an admission. No years of appeals, no chance of him ever walking free. On the other hand, no trial meant no full public airing of the evidence, and worst of all, no answer to the question that haunted all of them. He would not have to explain himself. He would never say why. On July 23, 2025, Brian Kohberger was sentenced. 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 10 years for the burglary. The judge, Stephen Hippler, spoke with real emotion. He talked about parents who drove their children to college in trucks full of moving boxes and had to bring them home in hearses. And he said something that cut to the heart of it, that the time had come to end this man's 15 minutes of fame. At the sentencing, the family spoke. The surviving roommates spoke, describing the trauma and the fear they still carry every single day. One victim's sister called him a sociopath, a psychopath, a murderer to his face. And through all of it, Brian Kohberger sat still, showing almost no emotion. When the judge asked if he wanted to say anything, any explanation, any apology, anything at all, he declined. He said nothing. And that silence is where this story leaves us. Here is what we actually know. We know a criminology student with no prior record of violence drove to a house full of strangers in the middle of the night and killed 4 young people, at least 2 of whom he may never have intended to kill. We know he planned it. He bought the knife months in advance. We know his phone had been near that house more than a dozen times before that night. And we know that when he finally had the chance to explain himself, in front of the world, he chose to say nothing. The prosecutor said there was no evidence Kohberger had any prior history of violence, no criminal record, nothing that pointed to this, which somehow makes it more disturbing, not less. There were reports, never confirmed by investigators, that his social media account had followed the female victims, that he may have messaged one of them. But the police never presented a motive. The families begged for one. The judge admitted the public may never get one. So why did he do it? Was it something about that specific house, or those specific people? Was it a fascination with the very crimes he was studying? Was it something inside him that no one saw coming? Or is the truth simply that some acts have no explanation that would ever be enough? I don't have that answer. Nobody does. Except one man sitting in a cell in Idaho who has decided to keep it to himself. So I'll ask you, after everything you've heard, the planning, the criminology degree, the phone near that house a dozen times, the 4 lives taken, what do you think was going through his head? Why do you think he did it? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and on this case, I really want to know what you think. And let's not let him be the last word. Let's remember the 4 people who should still be here. Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin. 4 young people with families, futures, and best friends. They deserved to grow up. They deserved so much more than this. If you want cases told carefully and honestly, with respect for the people at the center of them, subscribe. That's what this channel is about, and I'll see you on the next one.